Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first lecture in a series of 5 lectures. We're going to be taking you through some practical writing skills in this particular course. My name's Chris Crook. I'm one of the English teachers here at Remy University. I've taught the academic writing course before, and today I'm going to take you through something that is quite important actually. As you can see on the screen, we've got the slides behind me. We're going to be looking at something that I don't think is really thought through well, especially by Chinese English students when they're actually writing. We're going to be looking at thinking of the audience and addressing tone and register in your writing. So we're going to be looking in this series, we're going to be looking at tone and register in this first one. Next lecture will be summarizing and paraphrasing. Now this is actually an important skill to learn for exams. So on the IELTS exam, for example, there will be a section on paraphrasing. It's an important skill as well in academia to help protect yourself against accusations of plagiarism. In the third lecture, we'll be looking at writing a formal report. We're just going to very briefly glance at that. In these lectures, we can't give you every little detail. We can give you models and we can give you examples, show you where people have gone wrong, and maybe hopefully put you on the right track. Report writing is a very important skill. It's probably used more and more in professional life these days. We're going to look at how to do that. Writing for business purposes. This is a wide-ranging topic. We're going to be focusing on contact with native English speakers and how you will actually be writing in a business environment. There are some conventions that we need to look at. And finally, for everybody who is going to be looking at applying for a college overseas, we're going to be tackling this very, very tricky subject of how to write a personal statement. So we're going to be looking at especially structure in this and what things you need to put in, what things you need to take out. Every lecture is going to pretty much have the same structure. We're going to start off by reviewing what happened in the previous lecture, just so that everybody's up to speed with that. There's going to be a homework task at the end of each lecture. There's going to be a homework task, a little assignment for you to do just to check that you're actually keeping up and you're grasping the key concepts. We're going to be going through a sample answer at the start of each lecture. Obviously, this one doesn't have one because this is the first lecture, but we're going to be moving on with 2, 3, 4, and 5, looking at some sample answers that you'll be able to give with that. Then we're going to be looking at things that we'll be covering in this lecture. There's going to be a lot to pack into these things. Presenting some theory, presenting how that theory can be applied to practical examples. Reviewing, finally, we're going to take you on a big long journey all the way through these, so we need to have a little 5-minute break at the end where we just review the main points, the important points. Any important resources that I think that you should be looking at. There are some key points. There are some standard resources that almost everybody is using now. We need to point you in the right direction for that. And you'll be happy to know that we'll be giving you an extra, at the end of each lecture, there will be a homework task for you to complete. Today's lecture, we're going to be looking at audience, tone, and register. It is very important that we cover these things, because point number 4 here, connotations and denotations, that is something that I don't think a lot of Chinese students of English will really grasp, that there are implied meanings and there are dictionary meanings. We're going to look at how you can actually use this to improve your writing, why there are actually so many words in English to begin with, and why we use these words in the way that we do. Finally, point number 5, we're going to be looking at writing for academic purposes. I think that this is the main thing that we should focus on for university students, so we'll be focusing on how to actually write, some do's and don'ts, especially some conventions that you might not be aware of, even if you need to have these explicitly explained to you, I think. So we need to think about actually what happens when we write. You have to understand and you have to grasp, and it's kind of difficult to do if you're a student and you're always writing in a classroom. If you're always writing a homework task that is just being submitted to one person, the teacher, it's really difficult to understand and grasp this concept that you will be writing for many, many different types of people. People from different backgrounds will be coming together and reading the one piece that you've written. You need to realize this. You need to bear in mind that whatever you read, whatever you write is intended to be read. And you don't know who the audience is, so you don't know who is going to read your work. You need to think about that and really cover your bases. Sometimes you'll be writing a really tightly focused academic piece. Other times you'll be writing a very wide-ranging general piece. It's important to understand from the get-go what you're actually writing for and who your audience actually is. So if we look at this example to begin with, this is a couple of examples that I put together just to explain to you and just to show you rather than tell you what is important about tone. So if we look at this email here, this is an email asking for a reservation in a hotel, and you need to look at some of the key language here and the way that it's laid out. The language is actually quite formal here. Think to yourself, is this the kind of email that you would send to a friend? It's obviously not. This is someone writing an email to someone that they've never met before. So they don't take any chances with creating offense or embarrassing themselves. They write in a very formal register. They don't use contractions. They write very, very clearly and make sure that everything is explicitly stated in the email. So just take a moment, pause the video, have a look at this email, note the language that they're using. It's very, very different from an email that you would write to a friend or an email that you would write to members of your family sharing your holiday pictures or something like that. This is a very, very formal email. The tone fits the purpose. Again, we've got this second email. We're replying to this. Someone's actually forgotten to reply, or the person hasn't actually seen the reply from the hotel. They need to get a reply urgently. Notice again that we don't actually see any emotion here. We get a very, very straight, laid out piece of text, formal language. There's very, very little emotion here. There's actually the assumption that something else has caused the mistake. We're not laying blame on other people here. And just to give you a little bit of contrast, here is a completely inappropriate response from this woman, Anne. She's giving unsolicited advice. She's using capital letters. She's shouting at someone. She said, "I've already done this 2 hours ago. You need to check your emails." This is laying blame on the other person. This is not being particularly civil. We need to avoid this in our writing. We need to avoid being overly emotional. We need to also avoid unnecessary elevation of our language. 3 major things. You have to imagine your content, whatever you're writing, is a triangle. We have audience, purpose, and tone, and all of those will come together. You can't have your content without one of these corners of the triangle here. So make sure that you've considered all of these points before you even start. There's nothing wrong with preparation. There's nothing wrong with that at all. A lot of the times you'll be leaving things to the last minute. This is not really a good idea. Sit down, think about your audience, think about why you're writing, think about what tone you need to adopt to actually get your point across in the writing. You look at your paragraph first. You look at why you are writing this paragraph. Every paragraph, anybody who's done a standard academic writing course will know that the important thing is to realize what paragraph you're writing, why you're writing these things. Why do you write this introduction? Why do you write this conclusion? What's the difference between the conclusion and the introduction? Why do you need to mirror information from the introduction in the conclusion? What's the point of the body paragraphs? What order do you put the body paragraphs in? These are the questions that will be answered on a good writing course. And once you identify your paragraphs, and once you actually look at how the audience is going to react to this, you take yourself out of your own head and you imagine that you're reading your work for the first time, then you get the sense that you're looking at something that actually, if you knew nothing about the subject, does it make sense? Are you actually explaining things clearly enough? People write for many, many, many different reasons. You do write to inform. You do write to educate. You do write to entertain people. What's your purpose? If you answer this question, if you start with the question, why are you doing this, then the job becomes much, much easier. If you think about why, and you think about your audience, and you think about how much do they already know, do I know what they know? If you don't know, you have to lead people through step by step through your essay, through your email. Make sure that there's absolutely no confusion whatsoever. Don't try to be smart. Don't try to be witty. Don't try to show how clever you are. There's a purpose to this, and it's generally not to show how clever and amazing you are at writing English. Think about that. Think about what the other person is going to get from this. Put yourself in the position of the person who's reading. When you're speaking, put yourself in the position of the person who is listening to you. You need to get that message over the net. You really need to communicate. That's what communication is. It's a thought process, and you need to think about what thoughts you're actually communicating. Very, very simply, you can start off by asking yourself these critical thinking questions. Why do we write a play? Why do we write a TV show? Why do we write a movie? We entertain people. We sell tickets for this. Why do we leave instructions to a babysitter who's looking after our children? Because there are certain conventions that we want the babysitter to observe. We don't want the babysitter to bring round 25 of their friends and drink all the alcohol in the fridge. We just want them to do one thing. Make it clear that there are some consequences to certain actions. That is very important as well. When you're writing to a community leader, this will be much different in tone and much different in register to writing to your babysitter. You'll be wanting to be a little bit more formal. You want to get that guy on your side so that he will take your issues seriously. You lay out the issue. You make sure that you remove yourself from the writing, and you put the issue front and center and the community front and center, so that then the reader, this community leader, will be able to see that you're not doing this just for personal gain. Think about what you're doing. Think about why you're writing. Just take 5 minutes before you write. Think about it, then you can start. In academic settings, we'll often find that there are mainly 4 reasons. We summarize a text, we read a Shakespeare play, we have to summarize the intense emotions and the conflict and the relationships that appear in these Shakespearean plays. We analyze things, we make sure that we've understood it, we show that other people that we've understood it, we try and build on that to show our new theory. You can show that you've understood it by summarizing, and summarizing accurately and faithfully to the person who's actually written the key material. You synthesize material. So basically, it's essentially what my job is that when you're teaching, you'll be looking at 6 or 7 different resources. It doesn't all come out of my head, and I just lay it down. I do research. I take the bits that I think are important. I adjust them for different levels of my students, and then I deliver the lesson. I don't think too much about what I need to show my students. I don't need to show my students that I'm the authority here. I need to make sure that they understand. That's the main thing here. And the last thing on the list, evaluation. You will need to look at many, many different ways of doing things. If you're recommending a course of action, you need to be able to compare and contrast the two or three things that you've been presented with. The best way of doing things, the best software solution, the best type of textbook to use. You'll be asked to do all of these things. You need to be able to critically analyze and evaluate and present your opinion at the end of it. Identifying purpose. If you're reading somebody else's work, there are different ways of doing this. You look at the words that they've chosen. Writing is a conscious effort. It's a conscious activity. People choose words for a specific purpose. They do them deliberately. It doesn't just happen automatically. There isn't some subconscious process in the back of the head where it just vomits the words forward onto the page. It's a conscious process. If you're writing for a children's book, you don't use the same language and complex words as you would write for, say, a brain surgeon. So think about that. Sentence levels. The words will come together in a sentence, and then that thought will be expressed. What kind of thought and the stance that the writer takes in that sentence will be determined by the words, and then expressing the actual thought. You need to make sure that the thoughts are arranged in a logical order. For example, in a conclusion, you don't want to be giving people new information. This is illogical. We need to present the information in the body of the essay, and then in the conclusion, we don't present any new information. Think about where you're putting your sentences. Topic sentences are important to introduce each paragraph. Think about these sentences, look at them. You do need to get really down into this microscopic level of your writing. And essentially, looking at the whole thing as a finished work, as fait accompli, text level, you need to be looking at the overall tone. What will the reader walk away from your writing feeling? What will the reader take away from what you've written? Will they be confused? If they are, you need to go back and rewrite that. At the word level, we see things, we make the distinction between fact and opinion. Laying out emotionally charged words, giving your opinion, describing things in really emotive language, this is much different from actually just reporting on the facts of something, reporting on what happened. There will be, whatever field you're working on, there will be subject-specific words. So accountancy will have its own focused vocabulary. Finance will have its own focused vocabulary. Linguistics will also have its own subset of vocabulary. If you don't use these words, it kind of harms your credibility in some way because it just shows that you haven't really had a grasp of the material that you're talking about. Using imagery, using descriptions. The cliche is really the enemy of writing. If you're using the same old descriptions, you're using the same old adjectives. We try and look for higher level adjectives. We try and look for more persuasive imagery, more illuminating imagery in our writing. The verbs, are we looking at modal verbs where we're just suggesting lots of would, lots of could, lots of should? This is just giving advice. Is it saying that you must do something? Is someone saying that you have to do something? The use of these modal verbs really literally changes the mode of the sentence. You need to be aware of the impact of these imperative sounding sentences in your writing. We can use rhetorical devices, persuasive devices. Rhetorical devices are when you are not really expecting a response from the audience and you're just moving on to the next subject, maybe with a rhetorical question. You need to be using some of these things in your writing to break things up, to link your ideas together. Mostly with pronouns. The use of pronouns in your writing is usually a bad idea, especially in academic writing. You don't want to tell people, I think this, I think that. You want to tell people, it is clear that we're all imagining the same idea from a selection of evidence that's been brought forward. Sentence brings us to a narrative in our writing. We need to look at how we're moving on towards this goal, how we're moving on towards the conclusion. We need to look at how we're using our tenses. We need to look at, are we using present perfect tenses properly? Are we talking about the future? What's the time setting of our actual writing? We need to make sure that we've got a balance. If you just read a big long text full of imperative sentences, you must do this, you have to do that, you must do this, you have to do that. It's a diminishing return that you get on that. It's much, much easier to use a narrative device and actually show how things can go wrong rather than just say, you must do this, you must do that, you have to do this. Break things up. Make sure that you're getting a good balance in your sentences. It's really difficult to do. You need to be critically aware of how you're writing. Again, we need to look at how we can use compound sentences. We need to look at how we use complex sentences. We might start off with a simple sentence. We might start off with a complex sentence and then explain that idea using more simple sentences. So don't try to beat people over the head with how clever you are. Anybody can do that. Anybody can tell people how wonderful they are. Explaining things to people in the simplest possible terms is what you really need to be aiming for. At a text level, we need to be making sure we're using devices like topic sentences. We're using these in our body paragraphs to introduce a new topic, talking about these things, explaining things. Are we using connectors in a proper way? If you're just saying and then in your writing, that gets repetitive. Anything that repeats itself gets repetitive, it loses its message, and you can't afford for 1 nanosecond for the audience to go off topic. Keep it simple, keep it a little bit of variety, a little bit of novelty, a little bit of interest. that never hurts, okay? You never sit through a long, boring lecture. You'll always try and have a little bit of humor, a little bit of a joke, a little bit of self-referential humor is always good in any kind of lecture. People will just turn off, like I'm sure that some of you have done in your boring lectures. Think about your time, how you're ordering your information. Chronological. Chrono meaning time, logical meaning order. Do you want to put things in time order? Do you need to do that? Do you need to start at the earliest and go to the most recent? Start with the most recent and work backwards. Think about how you're going to be ordering this. Which is going to be the clearest for the audience? Which is going to be the best to understand? If you don't know anything about this subject, how is it going to be best expressed to someone else who's never had this subject explained to them before in their life? You need to think about these things. Looking at a text, looking at the form of a text, you will be looking at these text level devices, how things are laid out. We're going to have a look at a couple of layouts actually. Things for, the easiest example to look at is how things are laid out for children, how things are laid out for adults. There's a certain understanding that the adults will be able to understand larger volumes of more densely packed material, densely packed information than children will be able to understand. They will not really be able to grasp things. Children don't deal with holding different concepts in their head very well. Adults generally do. Looking at things that happen on a very kind of microscopic word level, things like yours sincerely. How is yours sincerely different from best regards? There's a level of formality here that we need to look at. What is the audience? The audience is very, very simple. Don't beat yourself up if you don't know who your audience is. It's very, very simple. The audience is anybody who is reading your material. Sometimes it can be a very specialized audience. It can be a group of other PhD students that are reading your PhD thesis. Sometimes it will be someone, it just be interested idiots, I call them. I'm one of these people. I'm interested in lots of different things. I just read these academic things, not because I have to for my job, but because I'm actually interested. I'm not a physician, but I like reading scientific stuff about physics. A lot of it goes over my head, but then we accept that because I'm not really the target audience. But the audience can be anybody who is reading your text. You need to be aware of this. So let's have a look. I'm going to break this up with a little bit of a challenge for you, a little bit of a matching game here. We've got several different texts on here, several different pieces of media. I would like you just to pause the video. I've just given you a lot of information to take in. Just pause the video for a second, have a look at the information, try and match the titles with the descriptions. Okay, so we've got the Gruffalo, the Radio 1 Breakfast Show, A Nightmare on Elm Street, a KS4, Key Stage 4, this is a textbook used in British schools, biology textbook, an advertisement for a Taylor Swift album, and a leaflet for PETA. PETA is the Ethical Treatment for Animals charity in America. Take a minute, pause the video, and we'll be back with the answers. See if you can match the audiences with the materials. Okay, so we're all back. Hopefully you paused the video, you had a little bit of, tried to match the material with the text. Hopefully you got what's on the screen, you matched what's on the screen. Obviously there are some obvious things where if it's a textbook, we're aiming for children. If it's a title like A Nightmare on Elm Street, we're probably looking at a more adult material here. This is actually a horror movie that's not intended for anybody below the age of 18 years old. Being able to actually acknowledge these things, being able to see, look at these little key words in the title, and then being able to match the audience to it, this means that you're actually thinking more critically, and that's going to help you a lot in the future. If we take this example, the Gruffalo. The Gruffalo is a very, very famous American kids book. We're going to have a look at how this has been actually put together. So here's a sample page that you can take a look at. You'll probably notice that it's not like a lot of the novels that young adults and adults read. A children's book is a very, very specific type of material intended for a very, very specific audience. First of all, we've got large fonts. We need to make these things very, very easy for children to read. Their actual recognition of handwriting is quite limited. Children will often find, you might often find that even though children can actually read and write pretty well, that they actually can only read and write their own writing pretty well, and they completely ignore any and all safety signs all around. So they don't really kind of see the difference between, the similarity between their own handwriting of, say, the English alphabet and a sign that's written actually in English. We need to kind of mitigate this as much as possible, reduce the confusion as much as possible for the children by making large, friendly letters, by making this thing more accessible to them. If you wrote this in impossible to read 0.12 microscopic size, then the children would just turn off completely. They need to see the words. They need to focus on the individual words, because basically the knowledge of the words, the memory of the word's meaning, and what the actual graphical representation is of the actual word on the page is a little bit shaky. We can't be too kind of ambiguous about the writing there. In the middle, you can see that we've got an illustration. Normally, we don't see illustrations in books unless they're actual technical illustrations. For example, you wouldn't see a nice little picture of, a fox in a nice park talking to another animal. You would see a very, very complex diagram of how your camera works, or how your phone works, or how your new Blu-ray player works. You would see a complex technical diagram like that. It's very, very rare that you actually see a cartoon representation like this. Again, we need to give children this. We need to give them some context. Their actual imagination, and they're too focused on understanding the words to actually connect their imagination to the words. At the bottom, the dialogue that we see here, it's very, very short, it's very, very simple, and most importantly, there's a lot of repetition in there. We see it a lot. We see a lot of these words being repeated. We need to do this for children. They can't grasp concepts like a conversation very, very easily. Compare that with this example here. This is a Stephen King novel. Stephen King writes big, thick books like this for adults. They're called airport novels. You read them on the airplane. They're aimed at adults. They're in the horror genre. They're aimed at adults, and you can see that it's almost completely different, completely the polar opposite of the children's book that we just saw. It's dense text. We see a lot of attempts to mirror real-life writing, real-life speaking, written down in the dialogue in the book here. And we have longer, more complex sentences. We have a lot more abstract emotional language as well. Children don't really have the emotional background for that. They don't really have the emotional empathy built in just yet to be able to understand how these characters feel. So the characters will be, one of the reasons why children's books are so boring for adults is that because there's very little empathy between the audience and the characters that are in there. In a book like Stephen King novel, the characters will be much more empathic, much more ambiguous, much less black and white, much more in the shades of gray. That's the type of thing we think about these audience. We think about the audience that we're writing for. Stephen King doesn't write children's books. One of the reasons that we need to have a look at this is because if we look at this Japanese sign here, is that there's a mix of messages here. The actual illustrations, the kind of funny illustrations that we see, don't match really quite well with the seriousness of the message. So the message here is that you shouldn't cross the train tracks when there's a train coming, or else the car will smash into it and everybody will die. That's actually being accentuated here by funny children, kind of childlike cartoons. It doesn't really work well from a Western point of view. Again, it's one of these things that you know things need to be accessible. While this is aimed at every audience, the messages and the text just don't work very well together, and it looks weird. It ends up on the internet on a funny kind of, Japlish website that people basically when people see these things, they will end up laughing at it. They don't take it seriously. Again, it dilutes your message, and that's something that you can't do. So again, we're looking at these word levels, we're looking at the words we're using, we're looking at the construction of our sentences, use of the active voice, use of the passive voice. You need to think about this as you're writing. It's quite all right to write something, put a line through it, and then rewrite it so it's got this maximum impact. Don't just run something off and hope that someone else will be able to make use of it. That's not really what we're looking at. Look at how complex your sentences are. Are they too complex? Are they complex sentences that will go up in the bathroom of a children's high school? You need to make things simple. You need to make things easy to grasp for children. You can't dress things up in overly complex sentences, okay? Children just don't have that capacity. Other people won't have that capacity either. Look at how your work is being presented. So there's an old joke where nobody ever uses Comic Sans. There are certain fonts that you never use. If you're giving a presentation for a CEO, you don't use happy, jokey comic book fonts. You don't look at kind of getting an illustrator in to actually give some happy cartoon characters. This just doesn't gel with the situation. A CEO is not going to be impressed with that. You're patronizing, you're talking down to someone. This is always something that is going to work negatively against you. You need to work at their level, speak to them through your writing as though you are an actual equal. In terms of registering the text, the register of the text, things will go from highly informal to highly formal. One thing that can happen, and one mistake that can happen a lot, is that you will overshoot, you will go too high with the level of your formality. We want to avoid inappropriately elevated language here. We want to make sure that we're not being too formal, and this really happens with our word choices. A lot of the things that you'll find in your dictionary is basically, they're not in order of formality. So the first definition is not the actual common usage of that particular word, the Chinese word that you just looked up. Try to avoid inappropriately elevated language. The only real way of doing this is to immerse yourself in the way that people actually talk. If it's too formal, it can actually have a more negative effect than being highly informal. If it's being highly informal, you can just put it down to ignorance. You can put something down to ignorance that guy doesn't know. If it's way too formal, then you run the risk of losing your message and losing the people that you're talking to. You've got to talk to people on a similar level. You've got to talk to people on the same level. You can't really go in with super polite language and expect people to understand what you're going to be talking about. So once again, pause the video, have a look at the situations on the board. Where would you put these situations in terms of language? How formal or informal would you expect people to be talking in this situation? So we've got a conversation between a teacher and a head teacher, a conversation between a customer and the shop assistant, and a letter from a firm of lawyers. So I think they're fairly easy. So once again, pause the video, take a minute to think about this. Where would you put these on the spectrum of formality that we've got at the bottom? We're not going to go through this in any great detail. The answers will vary. Okay, so now you've had a chance to have a look at where you would place these. We don't need to be, the only tricky one here that we've got is the conversation between the customer and the shop assistant. This is a kind of tricky situation because you don't want to be too formal. If you're going to Uniqlo to buy a t-shirt or something, you don't need to be overly formal. If you're going to go and buy a three-piece suit, you would expect a higher level of formality. You'd expect a higher level of education, a higher level of income for that. All the answers will vary depending on the situation, the exact situation, but they're all pretty formal to begin with. Choosing your words. I've got to take a moment and just say, please don't rely on your dictionaries this much. The dictionary is not a magic solution to everything. It only shows you the translation. It only shows you the definition. It will not show you how to use the word. All the words in everything that you've ever read have been carefully chosen to create a certain image in the person's head who's reading it. You need to have the same level of understanding and choose your words in a certain way. We're going to get into this with connotations and denotations. And I think that in a cross-cultural situation, Chinese to English, we need to be more aware of this. We're going to look at this very, very simple word, friend. These are different words that mean the same thing. They're synonyms. They all mean friend. They all have different levels of formality. Acquaintance, associate, will be quite high up on the spectrum of formality. Mate, pal, that will be further down the spectrum towards the informal end. You can actually insult a close friend by calling him an associate. If you have an argument with one of your friends, you can actually insult him by knocking him down this kind of social register by just calling him an associate or an acquaintance. These words are that powerful. Be careful with the words that you're choosing. Make sure that you're actually putting some thought into the words, the exact words. I'm not talking about the sentences, the words that you're talking about. We have two things in English when we're talking about interpreting words written down. We have connotation, we have denotation. Connotation is the implied meaning behind a certain word, a certain couple of words. For example, if someone says, he's my special friend, special friend has a certain connotation. The denotation is the literal meaning. Friend, someone that you know. So if someone says, he's my friend, there's a certain level of connotation that we can get. We can read different meanings into that. If you just work on level of denotation, it's just someone that he knows. So we can have lots and lots of fun with the word choices. We can have lots and lots of fun with the connotations mixing with the denotation. For example, the example that's on the board here, winter connotates cold and dark. Long evenings, very uncomfortable weather outside. Literally, the denotation is just that. It's the end of the cycle of seasons. We start with spring and we end with winter. It's the coldest season. That's basically the denotation. Use these things in your writing, but don't abuse them either. So, having a look at different ways that we can express things. We can talk about my house. We can talk about my home. There's a difference between a house, which is just a building, and the home that you actually, you actually consider to be the safe sanctuary away from all of the hustle and bustle of life. There's a difference with that. A bachelor will talk about his pad. It's a fashionable place to live. If you want to be very, very informal and invite people around, just say, come around to my place. You can call people, this is a very, very emotional word. We have these trigger words. Fat, you don't really want to talk about someone being fat. This is something of a negative connotation that people will have. We'll talk about people being clinically, the doctor will call you obese. You might want to be nice about it and just say someone is big boned. You might just want to be even nicer about it and say, well, you're curvy or you're plump. The level of offensiveness essentially comes through in these connotations. You don't want to say that my new washing machine, what can you say about that with the water bill? I have a lower water bill, I'm cheap, so I don't want to spend a lot of money on my water. I bought an economical washing machine. You don't say it's a cheap washing machine that saves me money, and you say it's an economical washing machine. It's much easier for people to accept that, especially when you try and sell them stuff. The car is economical. The implication behind that is that you don't really want to spend a lot of money on petrol. So if we have a look at negative emotions, we have more evil, we have less evil on a scale. You can have a look at the words here. We've got foul, bad, harmful, nuisance, someone's a wrongdoer. Have a look at these, sort them. Again, pause the video, just put the thing on hold. Try and sort them into more evil or less evil as you go up and down the scale. You'll be able to see that you'll be able to describe people in varying shades, and you'll be able to add a lot more nuance to your actual writing. Recognizing a text and being able to adopt your word choices to that text is very, very important. What are you writing? Again, we go back to this question, why are you writing? What is your purpose? The purpose and the audience, the two key things that you need to come together to create the tone and then eventually create good content. And bear in mind, when you've got good content sells. Content is king on the internet. If you want to have a career as a writer, you want to have a career as an expert on the internet, being able to write, being able to think about your audience and being able to think about the purposes that you're serving this audience, this does actually have some practical applications in today's world. So what are we writing? Are we writing a text for scientists? Are we writing an instructional text? Are we writing an informal text? What are you writing? What is this supposed to be? Is it just something that you've rushed together the day before a deadline and you've slammed some paragraphs together and hope that you're going to get a grade at the end of it? That's just not going to cut it. You need to sit down, think about things, and again, I've said this again and again and again, go slowly as you go through your writing process. Really identify these things. It will save you time later on. We're going to move on to tone. Tone basically expresses your stance towards a certain subject. You can be dismissive of something. You can support something. You can say that someone else is right, but there are some exceptions. The attitude that you take towards a certain subject is expressed through the tone that you get in your writing. It's implied. It comes through in your sentences. It comes through in your word choices. And it is very important that you hit the right tone, that you're not too dismissive, you're not too brisk, you're giving people enough time in your writing to actually really you appreciate other people taking the time to read your material. There's no real set category for tone. You can be playful, you can be somber, you can be sad, you can be happy, you can be ironic, you can be guilty. You can have all sorts of things. You can be, very apprehensive about something. You have to write emails where you say you're sorry. You have to write emails where you're telling someone off for doing something wrong. You're telling somebody that you're angry about something. You need to get this across in your tone. You get this through your word choices. You need to show people from the start how you are approaching what is the theme of your writing. How are you approaching a certain subject? Is it a serious analysis of a subject, or is it a more jokey, humorous piece that belongs in an editorial of a newspaper? When you're looking at other people's writing, you're looking at your own writing, you need to evaluate tone. You need to try and think whether you're being too playful, whether you're not being serious enough. You need to really think about this. Go through your writing, evaluate things. What do you want the reader? What do you want the emotions, in terms of emotions? What do you want from the reader? And is your writing doing that? Do you think your writing is doing that? If not, you need to go back and rewrite it. So think about your narrative. Think about the order that you're putting things in. The order is really the most important. Beginning, middle, and end. You can play around with that time order. The layout on the page. You need to show people that you've thought of them, that you're able to actually, lay things out on the page with some thought, without having. It's no good just to put things in a very kind of boring layout. Is not really going to engage people. So you need to think about how you're going to be engaging people, whether it's going to grab people with the important information to begin with. So when you read your work when you read somebody else's work, if you're doing literary analysis, think about the tone. Is it friendly? Is it sad? Is it shocking? Is it intended to shock? Are you watching something on Fox News, a populism piece, a populist news item on Fox News, or are you watching a more in-depth 30-minute documentary? Look at the different types of language that they use, the different ways that they present the same event. News is a very, very good resource for that. Look at different ways that the news stories will be reported. It will be the same event, but interpreted for different audiences. They'll all have a different agenda. Think about the purpose. Are people trying to persuade you? Are they trying to inform you? You can't do both at the same time. You can't persuade and inform. You can inform someone about it and then let people make their own decision, or you can persuade someone without really informing them of the facts. This happens a lot in politics, for example. Is that Donald Trump has shown criticized roundly for completely ignoring the facts, but being able to persuade people to vote for him in the elections. Think about what the purpose is. Identify the purpose, and then usually the actions of the person, the words that they've chosen, will become more apparent. Think about your audience. Think about the demographics of your audience. And think about how it's actually going to be laid out. Is it going to be printed out on a piece of A4, or is it going to appear in a magazine? Is it going to appear in a newspaper? Is it going to appear pinned up in my apartment compound, and I'm going to have to walk past it every day? Think about how it's going to be laid out. This is really important when you're thinking in terms of actually presenting your work in the best possible way, in a logical way for the reader to understand. So critical thinking questions as you're reading through the extracts. What's the tone? What's the mood? How do you feel? There's no real right answer to this. The text could fail to evoke the right emotions in you. That's not a failure on your part or the failure of the reader. That's just the failure of the writer. From the tone, from the register, try to identify how does the writer feel about this subject. If there's a lot of jokey, snide remarks in there, you can probably guess that the person who's writing doesn't really think much of this theory or this idea or this news event. What do you think the writer was aiming for? We're getting into a more critical analysis here. If you can watch a movie, or you can read a book and you can say, I know what you wanted to do here, but you did it wrong, or you didn't really get to that level, then we really get into kind of like a really deep critical analysis that will help you analyze your own work. The great thing is you can practice all you want on other people's work. Go back to your own work, think about these questions. Okay. What are the emotions that come up when you read that piece? Write these things down, make a note of it. It's difficult to get into the habit for these things. Critical thinking is a skill that you need to work at, that you need to practice. Get a pen, get a piece of paper, write down your thoughts, write down your first impressions. And as you're writing, go through and underline. This is what I had to do when I was a kid in high school. We were reading Shakespeare plays. We had to go through and show how Shakespeare was trying to get a certain emotion evoked in the audience. He was trying to, how does he pique these emotions in the audience? We had to go through and show, underline the words, write an essay about that. Do this with your own work. It really helps. We're going to conclude the presentation now with a look at some do's and don'ts of writing in academic register. A lot of these things can get lost in an academic writing course, and I just need to really go through them and explicitly tell you what you should and shouldn't be doing. Hopefully you'll be able to take something away from that, and it will help your own writing. So the genre, we need to think about what we're actually thinking. We need to think about the actual category of writing that we're writing. We're not writing an evaluation piece. We're not writing a jokey observation piece. We're writing something. It's an academic text. Okay. There are certain things that you need to have in here. There are certain things that you don't need to have in here, but they're nice to have anyway. We're going to go through all of these elements here. Even in the genre of academic writing, there is subgenres inside that. So are you presenting a lecture? Are you writing an essay? Are you writing a report? Is this a seminar? Seminar is much different to a lecture. What I'm doing right now, doing this lecture that is filmed, is much different to anything that I've done in the classroom. They all need different approaches, and we all need to think about how we present things, and the challenges that having an audience or not having an audience, or having just a camera looking at you like what's happening now, and to me, and how we're going to overcome these things, and how am I going to actually get feedback from a non-existent audience. Think about these things, how you're going to present these things. You need to think about managing large groups of people, small groups of people. It's going to be a presentation. You need to think about the graphical elements. Don't repeat graphical elements that are clear on the screen for everybody to see. Don't just read from the slides. You need to approach these in different ways. Features of academic writing, features of informal writing that we don't usually see in formal academic writing. The first is contractions. This is kind of like a tenuous point. Generally, we would say that you need to write as you speak. The tricky thing with English is that there's a rhythm to English, and there's a definite music to English. Sometimes it can sound a little bit clunky. It can sound a little bit awkward if you do include a contraction. If you don't include a contraction when there doesn't need to be, and it doesn't fit with the rhythm, read it through, sub-vocalize, read your writing out loud. Does it fit with the rhythm? Can you leave that contraction in? Will nobody notice it that much? Again, it's something I have a big argument with the other teachers about. Generally speaking, we don't like to see this stuff. Personalization. We are not interested in your opinion in an academic piece. We're interested in the facts, and we're interested in objective analysis. I had a great time. I believe in this. I believe in this. We believe this. You've got to get rid of these pronouns. They don't belong in academic writing. Okay, you can't have them there. Cohesive conjunctions. You need to link things together in your academic writing in a logical order. Okay, so you need to have these things as a result. You need to signpost the writing, and you need to say, as a result, what the result was. Therefore, we can see. Bring things together. Don't leave people confused as to what the result was. If you're going to talk about the result, we need a big signpost that says, this is the result. It's obvious to people. People are busy. Scientists are busy. Teachers are busy. They just scan through things. They don't have time to get the implied meanings. You need to go and really grab them and say, this is the result here that we've got. Relative clauses, things like simple sentences and complex sentences. We will be looking more for complex sentences in academic writing. We won't actually be looking for simple sentences. Basically because we're not children in academia. We're expecting people to be able to converse on the same level that I'm able to converse with you. So it's a reciprocal communication thing. Use these complex sentences. Don't use simple sentences unless you've got a really good reason for actually having the simple sentence in there. Repetition. With repetition, you'll always find that every time you repeat, the message gets diluted, and you can't really afford to have that. You need to demonstrate a wide range of vocabulary in your writing. The best way of doing this is to avoid repetition, so you don't say more and more, more and more, more and more people, more and more Chinese people, more and more tourists. We don't say that. We use different synonyms increasingly. That's a fine thing to put in there. We don't judge people by the amount that they write. We judge people by the quality of their writing. Okay. Exaggeration and hyperbole. Hyperbole is just when you say something. You say to someone, "I've told you 1,000,000 times." That's hyperbole. It's a stupid exaggeration. This does not belong in academic writing. We need to keep things simple. You can't say it's incredibly difficult to analyze the Chinese cell phone market. You can't put that in. You just need to simply state, it is difficult to analyze the Chinese cell phone market. That's fine. You don't need to get the same sense of arduous hard work and it's really difficult. It might be really difficult. You don't need to put that in your writing. Vagueness. This is a battle that I have to wage with students almost on a daily, well, not a daily basis, but a assignment by assignment basis. Things like that. Don't be too vague. Be precise. Go out and do your research. Think about the words. Think about the nouns. Be precise. Be specific. Okay. Don't overgeneralize. You can't overgeneralize. You can't talk in general terms. You have to go out and get that, get that information, get that research, really show that you've done the work and you know what you're talking about. Direct questions. This is just lazy. Don't start off your introduction with a rhetorical question. Have you ever wanted to be an accountant? My answer is no. You've just lost me. Okay. Don't ask these direct questions. You can ask rhetorical questions, but you need to answer that rhetorical question straight away. Okay? Don't put them in. It's really lazy writing. You're just taking a sentence, turning a sentence into a question, and hopefully someone will say yes. Don't leave things to chance with this. Value judgments, these are used much more carefully in academic writing, mostly because we don't deal with a lot of values in here in academic writing. We deal with facts, we deal with concrete things. We have to back things up, give evidence, show how people interpret a certain subject, and then say, this is what their value is. Don't go around and say, this is a stupid way of learning a language. It might not be a stupid way of learning the language. You can't make that kind of value judgment on methodology like that. You can present evidence, you can present a case, and then say, therefore, it's not as efficient. That's fine. You can say it's not as effective. Fine. But don't just dismiss something by saying something stupid. This is not what we do in academic writing. We want to get rid of the nouns. We need to, if we see that we've used more verbs than nouns, we need to think about rewriting. Okay, we need to look at a balance between these verbs and the nouns. But if we're looking at more verbs, if we're looking at padding things out with nouns, you need to be thinking about rewriting the sentence. The example that we've got here: people lack what they need for basic life, versus people lack the basic necessities of life. So people lack the things that they need for doing the things that. Things can get tied up because you always have to have a verb and then you always have to have an object. Just keep things simple and straightforward at this level. Okay. Golden rule: if you forget everything that I've said here, please, don't use slang. Don't use slang. People don't like it. Don't say things like, a hell of a lot of. That is not necessary in here. We can see there's a lot of, we can understand big numbers, okay? You don't need to use slang like this. Final thoughts, just to come up with some final ideas, just to recap. I've given you a lot of information here. Write as if you are the reader. It is difficult to do. Get out of this habit that every piece of writing is a homework assignment and is going to get graded. It's not necessarily the best thing, not necessarily going to be the case. Put yourself in the shoes of the person who's going to be reading. Consider your paragraphs, make your word choices, think about the order of your sentences, think about the order of the narrative that's going in there. Make sure that you've answered the question, why am I writing? This is most important. Start with why. There's a famous book like that. Start with why, then everything will come into place. Register is important. If there is any kind of conflict between the register and the composition of your writing, then you're going to start confusing people. If you have happy cartoons giving a very deadly serious message, this is going to create an emotional conflict that we're not really used to having in our heads when we read. Be aware of the connotations of your writing. Be aware that there are certain word choices that we just don't make anymore. In Chinese, you would never refer to someone as comrade. The meaning of that has changed in everyday parlance. You need to be aware that the same happens in English as well. Just reflect for a minute or two the impact that your writing is going to have on somebody else, this person who's going to be reading your material. You need to adhere to a certain convention. There are certain rules. There are certain things that you have to have in academic writing. Make sure that you've got all of them in there. I remember a writing assignment for my students where I asked them to compare and contrast two things. And I gave them the topic, and they just compared and contrasted them with no actual clear winner between the two. You need to take a stance. You need to take a stance on this. You need to compare and contrast. Tell me what that stance is. Give me the evidence to support that. Spend some time reading. Basically, that's my kind of ultimate message to people is read as much as you can in English. That will really help. Okay, time for the homework assignment. I'm going to give you an email from Sylvia Roberts, who's going to be emailing a hotel. She's going to come back with a reply. You're going to have a look at this. What are 4 simple questions? 4 simple questions. What is the tone? What is the purpose? Is the message clear? Is the tone polite? Is it rude? So have a look at the homework. We're going to go over some of the sample questions. I've got sample answers in the next presentation. But these are just some questions that you need to consider when you're reading these two pieces of text. So I'll put those up at the end. Pause the video, take your time to read it, and answer the questions as best you can. We'll be back with some sample answers at the start of the next assignment. So here is the first email from Sylvia Roberts. Pause the video, take some time to read that one. And here is the reply. So hit the pause button. Take as much time as you need to. There's no time limit on this. Take what you want. Read through it. Take as much time as you want. And we'll be back at the start of next class. It's a very, very simple, straightforward homework assignment just to get you all started. Finally, just to leave you with some of the books and the texts that I highly recommend. A handbook for international students. This is the one that is possibly most referenced to when I'm writing. This is the one that I recommend that you actually look at. It is written specifically, again, the purpose is specifically for international students. I'm sure that you'll get a lot from it. Have a look at the other references on here. There's lots of books here, lots of practical information that you can use in your own writing. So thank you very much for this first lecture. Hope you got something from it. And we'll see you again in lecture 2, which will be paraphrasing and summarizing.